So what do we mean when we talk about freedom? Freedom is a bit of a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, in particular, in American politics, but increasingly in the UK. But what do we actually mean when we say the word freedom? The concept of freedom has an extensive political philosophical history, and still to this day, it is one which is, I would say, generally commonly accepted by the average person. I think that if you ask someone, what does it mean to be free, or what does freedom mean, they'll give you a relatively simple answer, and that's, I'm able to do what I want. I'm free to do what I want to do. It's the freedom to do things, basically. So what I want to do in this video is sort of examine this common definition of freedom, which is almost commonsensical. It sounds at first, to be free is to do what I want to do. And I want to sort of explore the origins of it a little bit, but then also go through some of the issues with this definition, how it can justify some less than desirable consequences, how it leads to some strange examples in which you would consider someone to be free, and then also in the end present an alternative and a potential different way to think about freedom, and then how that can be applied to actual daily political life, and why it's actually very relevant to politics in the modern day, rather than just some outlandish, disconnected philosophical theory. As to my understanding, this conception of freedom as freedom to do something that you want tends to stem from Thomas Hobbes. In the Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' most famous book, he talks about freedom quite a lot, and his conception of freedom is a relatively simple one. It's basically freedom as motion. Freedom is a lack of external opposition to motion. So he applies it to an example of a rock. A rock thrown off a cliff is free until the point that it hits the ground, until the point where an external force limits its motion. It's what's called a negative conception of freedom, and when applied to humans in a society, in a state, and in political life, it basically means that you're as free as the lack of opposition or restrictions there are on your actions. The more stuff that you can do that you want to do, the more free you are. And any restriction on what you want to do is a restriction of your freedom. My freedom is defined by the amount of opposition that I have to doing what I want to do. And once again, it does sound almost commonsensical. It's like, well, of course, freedom is what I want to do. It seems to make some sort of sense. But what I want to do is go through 3 key examples that get often used in political philosophy and in philosophy around freedom to sort of highlight the issues with this common definition of freedom, and then sort of go through how this can, even though it sounds relatively natural and normal, it really leads to some not very nice consequences. So example number 1, there's 2 men on a boat. One of them has a gun. And then there's another person on the boat who doesn't have a gun. The person holds the gun up to your head and says, right, jump into the water, swim to shore, or I'm going to shoot you in the head, right? You look around, you're basically in open ocean, you can't see any land, there's some scary fish or sharks or something like that, I don't really know, and basically you're 90% sure that if you jump into the water you're going to die. You're not a great swimmer, you'd skipped some classes when you were in year 3, it's not going to go very well. So, your decision is, well, I'm going to jump in the water because you're facing either 100% chance of death with the guy with your gun to your head, or like a 90% chance of death jumping into the water and trying at least to, to swim in some sense. Are you free in this example? So is your decision to jump into the water a free one? So under Hobbes' definition, and under the definition that people would commonly cite, yeah, totally free. 100% free. That is your freedom to do this, because you want to jump into the water. It's your decision to make. It doesn't matter why you're making it in this sense. Your freedom, because you're not being obstructed in this sense to jump out of the boat, which of course is it's a slightly weird conclusion to sit with, right? And then example number two is a very common one used in political philosophy, and that's just the example of slavery. So let's say you're a slave, but your master is a relatively benevolent one. So they're pretty nice to you. They give you quite a lot of freedom. You're allowed to walk around town. You can basically do mostly what you want, or it just so happens that your owner or master's desires or wants line up exactly with yours. So you just happen to want the same things. So you're still doing what you want despite there being a power over you. Are you free in this example? Once again, this definition would say, yes, of course you are. You can do what you want. And then it kind of leads you down an awkward road of justifying slavery. Even though it sounds awful, the consequences in this sense are still the same. You're still doing mostly what you want. So you are still mostly free under this definition. And then number 3, and I think this is the one that really exposes the specific issue with this definition the most, is one that Hobbes specifically uses, and this is the idea of the locked door. So you're asleep, you're passed out, whatever. Some people come in, they pick you up, and they take you into a room, right? They put you in the room, they close the door. You wake up and you go, oh, this is a lovely room. This is the best. You know, it's got a nice real ale. Oh god, I can't point. There's a nice real ale poster over there somewhere. You know, that's pretty cool. There's a switch. You know, there's a Nintendo Switch. It's pretty nice. You know, you're gonna stay in the room. You really like the room. You're never gonna even leave. You're never gonna check the door. You don't care about the door. You're never gonna think about it. You like the room so much. You're never gonna leave, right? The door is unlocked at this point. You could leave, but you're not going to. It's a great room. It's got an ale poster. It's got a switch. It's the best. Are you free in this example? Most people would say yes. I would also probably say yes. You are free in this case. You know, you're doing what you want to do. There's nothing stopping you from leaving. However, the one that Hobbes specifically uses is, right, imagine all the same thing. You're in this room. There's a switch, the ale poster. You love the room. You're never going to leave, but the door's locked. You're still not going to check the door. You're still never going to think about the door. You don't care. You're never going to want to leave at all. But you can't. Are you still free in this example? Most people, when prompted with this question, even if given the previous definition, would say, no, you're not free because you can't leave. And this is one of the contentions that I would have largely with this definition. Hobbes' conception is purely about what you want to do, and it totally ignores the concept of choice. So in this specific case, the problem that arises is, what if you wanted to leave? What these free examples show is that this definition of freedom that people would commonly hold can lead you down some awkward paths and to some places where you wouldn't exactly feel comfortable in saying that something is free. So the definition that people often cite mustn't be what they actually think. So we need another definition, essentially. There are these free conclusions that we're not comfortable with at all. The first being jumping out of the boat, even though someone's got a gun to your head. Number two is the case of the slave. And number three, the case of the locked door. Hobbes would consider you to be free in all of these, and by the definition that most people would cite, you'd be free in all of these examples. But what is the commonality between these three things which makes people feel uncomfortable in saying that they actually are free in this case? I would say that it's the presence of an authority, or specifically an arbitrary one. So in the case of the boat, someone's got a gun over your head, right? That's an arbitrary authority. They don't have a right to have a gun over your head. Number two, slavery. You know, you can hardly get a more defined version of arbitrary power than, you know, slavery. Your owner doesn't have any, you know, reason really to have this control over or interference over the decisions that you make. And then the final one, even though it's less, I guess, clear, this arbitrary authority would be either the locked door or the people who just put you in there. In all of these examples, there is this presence of outside authority over you, which is restricting your potential actions, or at least influencing the choices that you make. So even though the choices that you make under Hobbes' definition would be free, is that really the case? And to further highlight this, I'm now going to bring up my alternative. This is what I prefer to justify freedom as, and I think that most people actually, when led down this line, would lead to this conclusion as well. And this is what's called the Republican conception of freedom. Not Republican in the American sense, just it's called Republican. So we've got basically two key theories to this. There's Wollstonecraft, whose champions the idea of freedom is independence, and there's I think it's Philip Petit, who idea of freedom from non-domination. So the idea of Republican freedom is that freedom is freedom from domination, essentially. So you're free when you are not being restricted by an arbitrary power over you. What is an arbitrary power? One which has the ability to take seemingly indiscriminate control over or interference over the decisions that you make. So the best example of an arbitrary power, like I said earlier, is slavery. The master and slave dynamic is the purest definition of an arbitrary power, one which has no legitimacy and someone with, you know, basically unlimited power to be able to interfere with the decisions that you make, right? Specifically in Wollstonecraft's example, it's very important to have independence of mind and this freedom of independence for a bunch of reasons. The first of these being, under this definition, these examples will lead to better conclusions, or at least ones that makes more sense. You know, in the first case, you wouldn't be free because the guy's got a gun to your head. That's not that. You know, he's interfering in your decisions because you have the decision to not have a gun to your head. The choice that you're making is coerced. It is under an arbitrary power. Under slavery, same thing. You're not free at all because there is an arbitrary power. Even though you're mostly doing what you want, there is still this arbitrary force being able to interfere with what you do. And in the final case of the locked door, the arbitrary power, wherever people who put you in there, or the door itself, in some weird abstract way, is an arbitrary force interfering in what you want to do, right? So Wollstonecraft takes this one step further, and where she states that, you know, in the case of the slave example, one cannot be expected to make the decisions that they want to, or at least make decisions which are free-willed or rational or in their own best interest when they are under a sense of extreme arbitrary power. You can't expect someone who is under that sort of pressure to make decisions which are rational or in their best interest. I think the best example would be to apply to a film. Django Unchained. Samuel L. Jackson's character is what would be considered a house slave. So in this sense, he's doing mostly what he wants. He has quite a lot of freedom because he's been with the family for a long time. But you can't expect him to make the decisions that would be, I guess, as Wollstonecraft put it, to reach their own virtue, because they're under such an intense form of arbitrary power that it has an effect on your ability to make the choices that you want to make. In this sense, Hobbes's description of freedom, i.e. the freedom to do what you want, is almost destroyed because you can't even make decisions that you want, because there's always this force influencing them and pressuring them and manipulating them in this sense. And I think that the Republican conception of freedom, it does follow relatively decently along Hobbes's argument for freedom as motion, but it doesn't lead to these awkward conclusions that I think most people would be uncomfortable with. You're probably thinking at this point, okay, this is great, a semantic debate about what freedom means, how interesting, but why is it important? For the people in this example, I don't think they care that much if they're free or not. I think if someone had a gun to my head and told me to jump out of a boat, the first thing I wouldn't be thinking of is, well, at least I'm free. However, what these examples can highlight is how our definitions of freedom, what we mean by freedom, can lead down some awkward avenues. If people followed their line of their general definition, you could basically lead to authoritarianism. You can lead to fascism, because you can be free under these sort of regimes, under this definition. And I think that's very important, because it allows authoritarians to use language of freedom effectively, because if someone ascribes to this definition of freedom, then they can it makes sense to them. Oh, this strong man who's going to make sure that no one can do these things. Well, I don't want to do those things anyway. That's perfectly fine. I'm still free. Where in reality, we should be more concerned with how we think of freedom. And I think the Republican conception is far better. The freedom from an arbitrary power, I think, is way better, because it still can incorporate this sense of doing what you want, but it doesn't lead these awkward examples, and it doesn't, in this sense, justify authoritarianism. To apply it further to authoritarianism, it's often, it's people on the right, especially in America, who use the language of freedom, but they don't seem to, a lot of them, especially in the Trump wing, where they tend to be more authoritarian. They'll for example expand the Patriot Act to spy on people more, but they still use the language of freedom, because under this example, if you considered this definition for its all, you're still free. You can still do what you want. It's just now there's a government watching you. Where under the Republican conception, that you wouldn't, you're considerably less free, because there is this influence over what you're doing. This is influence over the decisions that you're trying to make. When we think of freedom, there needs to be a robust definition in people's minds, so that they can't be essentially tricked by someone who hates freedom, someone who only wants to lead you down the paths of these examples where, hey, I know I've got a gun to your head telling you to do something, but you still want to do it, don't you? Just because the gun's to your head doesn't mean there's any sort of influence going on. I would encourage everyone to not just say, oh, it's just my ability to do stuff that I want to do, because as I hope I've shown, that leads to some very awkward consequences and could have a real detrimental impact on the political spectrum and on political life. Yeah, so overall, I think that the average person would say that freedom is to do what you want. I think this is a mistake. I think, as a free example showed, this Hobbesian definition is deeply flawed. I hope that the Republican conception is relatively convincing. I don't have enough time to go into it in its entirety in this video, but I hope people can do their own research, or I might even make another video about it if you'd like that. Where I can go more in depth about different conceptions, and specifically my favorite, the Republican, and what Wollstonecraft thinks, what Petit thinks, etc. And I think that freedom is a concept which needs to be really thought about more, because it's so important to our discourse and our society that we shouldn't allow it to be twisted to lead to outcomes and scenarios where our freedoms are massively restricted, such as authoritarianism. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did like this, like it. If you did like it, leave a comment. Ask for more, call me an idiot in the comments. That would be great. The more engagement, the better. And yeah, if you like the channel, please subscribe. I'm going to be making a lot of these, and I hope they're actually somewhat enjoyable. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day.